I always thought a family dinner was about warmth, about shared memories and the smell of home-cooked food welcoming you at the door, like stepping back into childhood. But that night felt different. I walked in, and instead of comfort, I felt the chill of judgmental eyes, as if I had crossed the threshold of a stranger's house. The table was dressed like it belonged in a magazine. White linen, polished silverware, candles glowing. Too perfect, almost staged. My parents exchanged a glance the moment I took my seat, and my stomach dropped. My mother's smile was stretched too tight, like a mask she couldn't remove, while my father tapped his fingers against the table, that old habit of his whenever he was about to deliver bad news. The longer I sat there, the more I realized this wasn't a dinner to bring us closer. It was a performance with me as the uninvited guest. My sister leaned back in her chair, her smug grin impossible to miss, like she already knew the ending of the play and was savoring my ignorance. I tried to focus on the small talk, on the clinking of glasses, but there was an undercurrent in the room. Thick, unspoken tension that pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. Every question they asked me was loaded, framed to highlight how different I was, how far I had drifted from what they called family values. My father's voice grew sharper with each word, the cadence rehearsed, like he had practiced this speech in the mirror. Then without warning, he leaned forward, eyes cold, and said the words that split my world open. From this moment on, consider yourself a stranger. My fork froze in midair. My mother didn't flinch, and my sister smirked like she had just won a silent war. They didn't stop there. My father continued, saying I was no longer welcome under their roof, that I should leave and never come back. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay still, to not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. It was surreal. One minute I was their daughter, the next I was nothing more than an intruder at their perfect little table. My mother finally spoke, her tone clipped, adding, "It's for the best. Don't come back here asking for help. We're done." In that instant, I realized this wasn't about a single dinner or a single disagreement. This was about control, about erasing me from the narrative they had been writing for years. And as I stood up, the legs of my chair screeching against the floor, I made myself a promise. If they wanted a stranger, then I would become one. But not the way they expected. They thought they were cutting me off, that they had stripped me of everything. But what they didn't know was that in rejecting me, they had unleashed something far stronger than their shallow approval. They had set me free, and freedom has a way of reshaping a person into someone unrecognizable, even to their own family. I walked out of that dining room with my head held high, but the moment the front door closed behind me, the night air hit my face like ice, and I almost collapsed under the weight of what had just happened. My childhood home stood there glowing warmly, yet it felt more foreign than any place I had ever been. I could still hear their voices echoing in my head, each word like a knife carving me out of their story. It wasn't sudden, though. It had been building for years. They had always treated me like the inconvenient child, the one who never quite fit into their picture-perfect image, while my sister was showered with praise no matter what she did. She could fail an exam, crash a car, or waste thousands of dollars, and they'd rush to defend her, saying she just needed more understanding. But if I spoke up for myself, I was difficult, ungrateful, selfish. Tonight was only the climax of a play I had unknowingly rehearsed my whole life. I thought of the countless sacrifices I had made just to earn a fraction of their approval. Taking the extra shifts to cover bills when Dad lost his job for a while, lending my sister money when she overspent on her new apartment, even canceling vacations so I could babysit when she claimed she was too busy. And yet here I was, standing on the porch with nothing but my coat draped around me, labeled a stranger by the very people I had bent myself backward to please. I should have been crushed, but as I stood under the cold glow of the porch light, something inside me shifted. They thought they had exiled me, but in reality, they had just freed me from the endless cycle of proving my worth to people who had already decided I wasn't enough. My sister's triumphant smirk replayed in my mind like a challenge, and I felt my hands tighten into fists. She wanted me gone because without me, she would finally have everything. My parents' resources, their attention, their blind loyalty. She believed she had won. But as I started walking down that familiar driveway for what might have been the last time, I realized she had underestimated me. For the first time in years, I wasn't the child begging for scraps of love at their table. I was someone who had nothing left to lose, and people like me are the ones who rise from the ashes. I didn't know how yet, but I knew this story wasn't ending here. They had written me out of their family, but I was going to write the next chapter myself, and in it, I wouldn't be the victim. I would be the one they never saw coming. The street was quiet as I walked away, the kind of stillness that makes every footstep sound louder than it should, echoing against the pavement like proof that I was really, truly on my own. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, there were already messages. My sister had wasted no time. Screenshots of the group chat I wasn't supposed to see, where she gloated to her friends about how the plan worked, how Mom and Dad finally cut me loose, how she'd have full access now. She even attached a photo of me at the dinner table, taken secretly while I sat there, unaware, my face caught in the middle of their performance. My stomach twisted, but not from sadness. It was fury. All the pieces started falling into place, the little comments she had whispered. To our parents about me being irresponsible, the way she had conveniently turned them against me every time money or property was involved, the way she always made herself look like the dutiful daughter while painting me as the rebellious one. This wasn't just family drama. This was orchestrated. She had been building her case against me for years, brick by brick, until tonight when she got her victory. But what she didn't count on was that her gloating would light a fire in me stronger than anything I'd ever felt. I stopped under the street lamp, reading every cruel word she had typed, and I swore silently that this wouldn't end with me being erased. I thought back to the house, to the walls filled with memories, to the heirlooms my grandmother had left us, things that were meant to belong to me as much as to her. I thought about the accounts I had helped manage, the documents I had signed, the investments I had made alongside my father back when he trusted me more than her. They wanted me to be a stranger, but strangers don't leave behind receipts, and I had more proof than they realized. My breath fogged in the cold night, and I suddenly knew with certainty that I wouldn't just walk away empty-handed. If they wanted to cut me out, then I would show them what it meant to lose someone who had quietly held their fragile empire together. My sister could have the hollow victory of their applause tonight, but tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, I would remind them of the one thing they had forgotten. I was not powerless, and I had nothing left to fear. I barely slept that night. I lay on my small apartment bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, every cruel word from dinner replaying in my mind until it burned itself into my chest. By morning, the sting had dulled into something sharper, more deliberate. I opened my laptop, dug into the folders I had saved over the years, and pulled out the evidence no one in my family seemed to remember existed. My father had put my name on certain documents when I helped him co-sign years ago, back when my credit was better than his. He thought it was temporary, that he'd fix it later, but he never did. Bank accounts, tax records, investment shares, all with my signature next to his. Quiet contributions I had made with my own money sat right there, buried among his, too easy for them to overlook. But I hadn't forgotten. My phone buzzed again, my sister, flaunting a new shopping spree, bragging about Dad wiring her money that morning to celebrate a clean break. She really believed she had locked me out for good. She didn't realize she was building her castle on foundations that still had my name carved into them. The rage I felt turned into something colder, steadier, almost intoxicating. I wasn't going to scream or beg. I wasn't even going to warn them. Instead, I began drafting emails, one to the family lawyer, one to the accountant, one to the property manager who still had me listed as co-owner on the old house they thought they controlled. By noon, I had lined everything up, every piece of paper that reminded the world I was not some stray they could kick aside. I printed copies, organized them neatly, and slipped them into a binder. It felt clinical, almost like preparing a case file. For the first time in years, I wasn't playing defense. I wasn't trying to prove my worth or explain myself. I was holding the facts, the hard proof that their little scheme was built on lies and arrogance. I imagined my sister's face when she realized that while she was busy scheming in group chats, I had the receipts that could unravel her entire victory. And my parents, so confident in their performance at that dinner, would have to face the truth that in cutting me out, they had underestimated me entirely. That thought didn't just comfort me. It fueled me. They had cast me as the stranger at their table, but soon, I would become the storm at their door. The following week was like watching a stage play unravel from backstage, and for once, I was the one pulling the strings. My sister paraded around online, posting photos of her new beginnings, flaunting gifts my parents had bought her, even hinting that she might move into the old family house soon. Every post made my blood run hotter, but I didn't comment, didn't argue, didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, I sent a quiet message to the family lawyer, attaching the documents I'd carefully prepared. I didn't write a speech, didn't add emotion, just clean proof of ownership, co-signatures, and the undeniable fact that I still had legal ties to everything they claimed was hers. Within 2 days, I got a reply. "We need to discuss this immediately." That's when I knew the silence was starting to work in my favor. My parents had no idea what was coming. I pictured the moment they would open the letter from the lawyer, the way my father's tapping fingers would freeze midair when he realized I wasn't erased as easily as his words at dinner. My mother would probably try to smooth it over, pretend it was a misunderstanding, while my sister's face would darken as she realized her perfect victory had cracks running straight through it. The thing about being the so-called stranger in a family is that people stop watching you closely, and that's where their mistake lies. While they were busy celebrating my absence, I was building my return. I remembered all the years of being sidelined, the birthdays where my gifts were an afterthought, the holidays when my achievements were drowned out by my sister's constant need for attention. All of it condensed into this moment. Finally, I had the leverage, and for once, I wasn't afraid to use it. I walked to the post office that evening with my binder clutched tight, mailing out certified copies to ensure nothing could be lost or ignored. As the clerk stamped each envelope, I felt a rush of power I had never experienced before. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic, cinematic sense. It was quieter, sharper, like slipping a blade into the cracks of their carefully built facade. And I knew, as I left the post office under the dim glow of the streetlights, that the next chapter was no longer theirs to control. It was mine. A few days later, the silence broke, and it came not with a phone call, but with a pounding on my apartment door. I opened it to find my father standing there, face flushed with anger, clutching a stack of papers like they were burning his hands. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice trembling, not with authority, but with panic. Behind him, my mother lingered, her eyes darting around as if the neighbors might see, her composure cracking in a way I had never witnessed. I let them in, calmly, deliberately, as though I had been expecting this scene all along. My father slammed the papers down on my coffee table, pointing to the highlighted sections that bore my name. "These signatures, these accounts, you weren't supposed to—" He trailed off because he knew exactly what they were. Proof. Binding, legal proof that their little empire wasn't theirs alone to control. My mother finally spoke, her voice brittle. "Why would you do this?" "We thought you understood. We thought you wanted peace." I almost laughed. Peace? They hadn't invited me to peace at that dinner table. They had handed me exile, stripped me of my place in the family, and declared me a stranger. Now they were realizing that strangers don't just disappear quietly. I leaned back, arms crossed, and said evenly, "You told me I was no longer part of this family. So consider this the actions of a stranger. A stranger who happens to have rights you overlooked." The room went still. My father's bluster collapsed into silence, and my mother looked away, shame flickering across her face for a brief, unguarded second. And then, almost on cue, my sister stormed in without knocking, her heels clicking on the cheap laminate floor. She didn't even greet me. She went straight for the papers, rifling through them with frantic hands. "This doesn't mean anything," she hissed, though her voice betrayed the tremor of fear. "You're just trying to ruin everything. Dad, tell her this doesn't count." But he couldn't, and she knew it. I watched as her confidence drained, replaced by something raw and ugly. She had built her identity on winning, on being the golden child, and for the first time in her life, she was cornered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You wanted me gone," I said softly. "You got your wish. But you don't get to erase me. Not from the records, not from the assets, not from what's rightfully mine." For once, none of them had a retort. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was damning. It was the moment they realized the roles had shifted. I wasn't the desperate daughter begging for scraps anymore. I was the one holding the pen, and with it, I could rewrite everything they thought was settled. The fallout began almost immediately. That night, after they left my apartment in a cloud of anger and stunned silence, I knew the phone calls would start. And they did, first from my father, then my mother, then relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. Some tried guilt, weaving words like family unity and forgiveness, as if I had been the one who crossed a line. Others were harsher, accusing me of betrayal, of airing dirty laundry, of being selfish for standing my ground. But I had prepared myself for this chorus. I recognized it for what it was, fear disguised as morality. I didn't respond to most of them. Instead, I sent one carefully crafted message to the lawyer: proceed as planned. The next few weeks became a storm my parents hadn't anticipated. The family home, which they thought they controlled, was suddenly locked in legal review because of my co-ownership rights. Accounts they assumed were theirs to drain were frozen until signatures, including mine, were provided. My sister raged online, posting cryptic stories about snakes in the grass and betrayal, but she never mentioned my name directly. She knew better. Every smug photo of her shopping sprees stopped, replaced with silence, and that silence told me everything. The money faucet had been turned off. And for once, I wasn't the one begging. I was the one with the power to decide how things moved forward. At night, I would sit at my desk, flipping through the binder of documents, reminding myself that this wasn't revenge for the sake of cruelty. This was balance. For years, I had been the silent pillar holding up a family that saw me as expendable. They had mistaken my quiet sacrifices for weakness. Now, every page of those documents, every line of ink with my name beside theirs, became a weapon forged from their own arrogance. My sister showed up again one afternoon, this time alone, pounding on my door with fists that shook with rage. When I opened it, her face was streaked with tears, her voice breaking as she spat, "You've ruined everything. They don't look at me the same anymore. You've destroyed what I built." I looked her straight in the eye, the same sister who had once smirked at that dinner table while I was cast out, and I told her the truth. I didn't destroy it. You did, the moment you made me your enemy. And then I closed the door, leaving her screams muffled behind the wood. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being shut out. They were. And in that reversal, I felt the kind of justice they would never understand. Weeks turned into months, and what began as a single dinner table exile became the unraveling of everything my parents and sister thought they had secured. Court letters arrived at their doorstep, stamped and sealed, demanding signatures, clarifications, and compliance. My father, once the man who barked orders and expected obedience, now sat across from me in a sterile lawyer's office, red-faced and humiliated, forced to acknowledge me as an equal. He tried to negotiate, his voice low and urgent, whispering about family reputation and keeping things quiet. But I only slid the papers back toward him and said, "These are my terms. You don't have to like them, you just have to sign." My mother avoided my eyes during those meetings, her hands clasped in her lap, trembling slightly. She didn't scold me anymore, didn't lecture me about gratitude or respect. Instead, she carried the weight of realization, the heavy awareness that the daughter they had cast aside was the one now dictating their future. And my sister, oh, she couldn't hide her fury. She sat across the room, arms crossed, foot tapping, her glare burning holes into me, but she was powerless. Every tantrum, every outburst, every manipulative sob ended the same way, with silence, with the lawyer reminding her of what was on record, of what couldn't be undone. Online, her facade began to crack. Friends whispered about the inheritance she claimed was hers that was now under dispute, about the sudden halt to her glamorous lifestyle. She deleted posts, made excuses, and for the first time, her audience saw the cracks in her Golden Girl act. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had wanted me gone, invisible, erased from their perfect narrative. Instead, they had handed me the spotlight, and in it, their flaws and failures glared brighter than ever. I didn't seek revenge by screaming or destroying. I sought it by standing steady, by refusing to shrink back into the shadow they built for me. The balance shifted in silence, with signatures and stamps, with frozen accounts and enforced boundaries. They had thrown me out as a stranger, but now, sitting in that lawyer's office with every eye on me, I was the one holding the pen that decided what stayed and what was lost. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking to belong. I was watching them scramble to hold on. The day the judge's ruling came down, I stood in the courthouse hallway, binder pressed against my chest, my heart beat steady in a way it hadn't been in years. The courtroom had been tense, every detail laid bare. The accounts, the property, the signatures they had dismissed as meaningless. My father tried to bluster through it, arguing about intent and family understanding, but the judge cut him short with a single line that still rings in my ears. Intent is irrelevant. What matters here is ownership, and she owns half. The words dropped like a hammer, and I watched the color drain from my father's face. My mother looked down at her lap, her hands twisting nervously, while my sister sat frozen, lips parted in disbelief. The ruling was clear. I wasn't just a name on paper. I was an equal partner in everything they had tried to erase me from. Half of the house, half of the accounts, half of the investments they thought were theirs alone. As the gavel struck, sealing it, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stood, collected my papers, and walked out, leaving them to sit in the silence of their shattered assumptions. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, the trees burning with color, and for the first time in months, I felt a lightness in my chest. My phone buzzed with messages, some from extended family demanding explanations, others offering quiet support. I ignored them all. This wasn't about anyone else anymore. It was about me, finally carving out space that was mine, space they couldn't take away with a sentence at a dinner table. My sister cornered me on the courthouse steps, her voice breaking as she hissed, "You'll regret this. You've ruined us." I looked her in the eyes, calm and unshaken, and replied, "No. You ruined yourself the moment you decided I didn't matter. All I did was stop playing your game." She had no answer. She turned and stormed off, leaving her heels clattering angrily against the stone steps, her shoulders hunched like the weight of defeat was finally settling on her. I didn't chase her, didn't call after her, didn't even turn my head when my parents followed her in silence. They had wanted me out of their lives, and in a way they succeeded. Because from that moment on, I knew I would never sit at their table again. Not as a stranger, not as a daughter, not as anything. I was free. And freedom, I realized, was the one inheritance they could never strip from me. In the weeks after the ruling, the calls and messages came in waves, sometimes pleading, sometimes furious, sometimes dripping with false sweetness, as if sugarcoating could erase years of cruelty. I didn't answer. I let them ring, let the texts pile up, until the noise faded into background static I could finally ignore. My sister's online presence all but vanished. The girl who once flaunted every shopping spree and weekend getaway now posted nothing, her silence louder than any confession. Friends who once fawned over her began to drift away, curiosity giving way to distance when her life no longer sparkled with borrowed wealth. Meanwhile, I was building something different. With my share of assets finally secured, I moved into a place of my own, not grand or flashy, but mine. Every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall, was chosen because I loved it, not because it fit someone else's vision of a perfect family image. I spent evenings reading in quiet peace, mornings walking streets where no one judged me, and days working toward goals that were finally mine alone. The strangest part was the calm. For years, I had lived under a constant hum of anxiety, always anticipating the next dismissal, the next insult, the next sacrifice expected of me. But now that hum was gone. It was as if I had been carrying a weight so long I forgot it was there, and suddenly I could breathe without effort. My parents tried one last time, inviting me to a family reconciliation dinner. I read the message twice, the irony almost making me laugh. The same table where they had declared me a stranger was now the place they wanted me to return to, as if their words could be undone by a polite invitation. I didn't respond. Instead, I closed my phone, poured myself a glass of wine, and watched the sun set through my own window, golden light filling a space that was finally safe. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense, not the kind with shouting or public scenes. It was steadier, more lasting. The knowledge that they could no longer touch me, control me, or define me. They had wanted to cast me out, and in doing so, they gave me exactly what I needed, a life beyond them, a freedom they would never understand. Months passed, and the dust of our war finally settled into something permanent. My sister still tried to bait me from time to time, snide emails about how family is family, followed by veiled threats that I was burning bridges I might need someday. I didn't reply. Bridges built on manipulation aren't worth saving, and I had already crossed into a life where she had no power. My parents grew quieter too. Word reached me through distant relatives that they had stopped boasting about their perfect daughters, stopped hosting elaborate dinners, and started avoiding questions about the family altogether. Their silence wasn't peace, it was shame. They had gambled everything on keeping up appearances, and losing me meant the cracks were visible to everyone. Meanwhile, my life was blooming in ways I never expected. I went back to school, finishing courses I had once abandoned because my family needed me to sacrifice. I started investing with intention, not just patching their mistakes, but building something sustainable for myself. Each small success felt monumental, like I was reclaiming the years stolen by their favoritism and demands. Friends who had drifted away during the chaos began circling back, not because of pity, but because they saw me standing taller, steadier. I realized that true connection had nothing to do with bloodlines or last names. It came from people who valued me without conditions. One evening, while packing boxes for a move into a larger place, I came across an old photo, me and my sister as children, arms slung around each other, grinning like the world hadn't yet divided us. For a moment, my chest ached. Then I set it down, not in anger but with clarity. That girl in the photo didn't exist anymore, and maybe she never really did. Families built on favoritism and control aren't families at all. They're cages. And I had finally walked free. The night I settled into my new home, I stood by the window, city lights stretching before me, and whispered a truth I had waited my whole life to understand. I wasn't the stranger they cast out. I was the survivor they created. And surviving wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. Not long after I settled into my new rhythm, the final piece of their control slipped away, almost quietly. A letter arrived in my mailbox from the family's old property manager. The house they had fought so desperately to claim was being revalued, and my name was still listed as co-owner. Attached was an appraisal that confirmed what I already knew. My stake was significant, undeniable, and impossible for them to erase without my consent. I sat there with the envelope in my hands, remembering the night they told me to consider yourself a stranger. They had wanted to exile me with words, but words can't erase ink. Ink is permanent, my father called 2 days later, his voice hoarse, asking if we could work something out. He sounded smaller than I'd ever heard him. Like a man who had been stripped of the certainty that once made him dangerous, I listened in silence before answering with the same calm I had carried since that courthouse. We already worked it out. The judge signed it. He didn't argue. He only sighed and hung up, and I knew then that the war was truly over. Not because I had crushed them, but because they finally realized I wasn't coming back. My sister tried one last tactic, sending me a long email filled with fake apologies, blaming our parents for turning us against each other, insisting she had only gone along with them because she had no choice. I stared at her words, waiting to feel something, anger, sadness, even pity. But all I felt was distance, the kind of vast, unbridgeable gap that grows when trust is shattered beyond repair. I didn't reply. Instead, I archived the email, filed the appraisal with the rest of my documents, and went back to my life, a life no longer tethered to their chaos. On a quiet Sunday morning, I walked through a farmer's market in my neighborhood, carrying fresh flowers and bread, and it struck me how ordinary joy had become. No tension buzzing in my chest, no fear of the next phone call, no need to shrink myself to fit at a table where I was never welcome. Just freedom. Just peace. And as the sunlight hit my face, warm and steady, I realized something powerful. They had cast me as a stranger, but in truth, I had finally become someone even better, my own person. Someone they could no longer define, no longer diminish, no longer control. The stranger they created had become the strongest version of me, and that was the ending they never saw coming. Seasons changed, and with them, the last threads of connection to my parents and sister unraveled. By winter, the lawyer finalized everything, and the files stacked neatly on my shelf told a story my family never wanted written, that I was equal, that I had always been equal, and that their attempt to erase me had failed in the most public and permanent way possible. I didn't flaunt it, didn't post online or tell the world. My revenge wasn't spectacle, it was stability. While they whispered excuses to anyone who asked why the golden image of our family had shattered, I built a life with foundations they couldn't touch. My father's health began to falter, and though distant relatives suggested I should visit, I didn't. Not out of cruelty, but because I finally understood. Forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the place that broke you. It means letting go of the need for their approval altogether. My mother sent a card for my birthday, the handwriting shaky, the message clipped. "We hope you're well." I placed it in a drawer, unread beyond those words, because I didn't owe them more than silence. My sister's downfall was harder to ignore. I heard through mutual acquaintances that her debts were piling up, that the friends who once circled her had vanished when the money dried up. She tried blaming me, telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen what was hers. But the truth was undeniable, stamped in legal ink. She lost because she built her throne on lies. And when the lies collapsed, there was nothing left for her to stand on. One night, I found myself back near the old neighborhood, walking past the street where I grew up. The house was lit inside, figures moving through the windows, but it looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken by years of distance and perspective. I stopped for a moment, watching from the shadows, unseen. I felt no urge to knock, no ache of longing, no pull to rejoin. That house, that family, that version of me, they were ghosts. And ghosts don't need to be resurrected. I turned away, the sound of my boots crunching in the snow steady and sure. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from their rejection or toward their acceptance. I was simply moving forward, free and whole, carrying nothing but myself into the future. Spring came, and with it, a sense of renewal I had never known before. My days no longer revolved around surviving the weight of their expectations, but around shaping a future that was entirely my own. I poured energy into work, into friendships, into small joys that once felt impossible. Planting flowers on my balcony, cooking dinners where the only voice that mattered was mine, laughing with people who saw me without conditions. My sister reached out again, this time not with anger but with desperation. Her message was long, filled with pleas about how she had learned her lesson, about how we could start over as sisters. I read it once, slowly, letting each word settle before closing the screen. It wasn't anger that stopped me from replying. It was peace. I no longer needed to prove my worth to her or to anyone. She had built her kingdom on my silence, and now, with silence in return, I left her to face the ruins alone. My parents, too, grew quieter with time. The stories about them trickled in through whispers. My father rarely left the house, my mother kept to herself. The grand dinners stopped. Without an audience, their need for control seemed to fade, and in that emptiness, I wondered if they finally understood the cost of pushing me away. But understanding didn't change the past, and it didn't undo the damage. I chose not to go back, not even out of curiosity. Because freedom, once tasted, is too precious to risk for nostalgia. One evening, I sat at my desk, flipping through the last of the legal papers, and I realized I didn't need them anymore. The proof had served its purpose, the revenge had been delivered, and what remained was something greater than victory: release. I placed the binder on a high shelf, out of sight, no longer an active weapon, but a quiet reminder that I had survived. And as I looked out the window at the city bathed in the soft glow of dusk, I smiled, not because I had won against them, but because I had finally chosen myself. For the first time, my story wasn't about being cast out or fighting for scraps of belonging. It was about standing on my own ground, unshaken, unafraid, and knowing deep in my bones that I was never the stranger. I was the one who walked away and built a life worth living. Summer rolled in, and with it came a warmth that felt different. Not just the sun on my skin, but a steady heat inside me, the kind that comes from finally living on your own terms. I had stopped checking for messages from them months ago, stopped waiting for the next jab or the next guilt-laced plea. Instead, my days filled with the sound of my own laughter, the rhythm of work that actually mattered to me, and evenings where peace wasn't something I craved but something I lived in. I started traveling, short trips at first, then longer ones, places I had only dreamed of when I was tethered to their demands. Each time I set foot in a new city, walked unfamiliar streets, tasted food I had never tried before, I felt layers of their control peeling away. The further I went, the more I realized how small their world had always been, and how much bigger mine could be without them in it. One afternoon, while walking along a pier in a coastal town, I watched families gather, parents laughing, children running with ice cream, couples holding hands. For a flicker of a second, I thought about what I had lost, the illusion of belonging to something whole. But then the memory of that dinner came rushing back, the coldness in their eyes, the finality of their words. Consider yourself a stranger. That wasn't family. That was a stage play, and I had been cast in a role I never agreed to. By walking away, I hadn't lost a family. I had lost a cage. Word eventually reached me that my sister had left town, chasing opportunities that never panned out, her reputation too tangled in whispers to recover. My parents had grown older, quieter, shadows of the people who once believed they could control everything. But I didn't visit, didn't check in, didn't need to. Their story was no longer mine. And as I leaned against the railing, watching the sun dip low over the water, I realized something that tied everything together. Revenge hadn't been the documents, the rulings, or the assets I secured. It was this moment, standing alone, free, happy, and untouchable. Their attempt to erase me had only carved me deeper into myself, stronger than I had ever imagined. And for the first time, I knew the truth. I hadn't just survived their betrayal, I had transformed it into the very thing that set me free. The years that followed were nothing like the future my parents or sister had once envisioned for me. They thought casting me out would break me, that stripping me of their approval would leave me wandering, desperate, and alone. Instead, it became the catalyst for everything they never believed I was capable of. I built a career from the ground up. No shortcuts, no handouts, no safety nets woven from someone else's influence. Every step was my own, and with each achievement came a kind of satisfaction they would never understand. The pride of knowing I owed nothing to anyone who had tried to erase me. My home became my sanctuary, a place filled not with relics of their judgment, but with symbols of the life I had created. Books stacked neatly on shelves I had built myself, photographs of friends who had become my chosen family, plants that flourished because they were nurtured in peace, I discovered love too. Not the kind my sister flaunted for attention, shallow and brittle, but something quieter, steadier, with someone who saw me not as a burden or a competitor, but as an equal. Together we dreamed of futures that stretched far beyond the walls of the house I had once been denied, futures free from the poison of favoritism and control. Yet even with all the growth, there were moments when the past tried to creep in. Sometimes, late at night, I would remember my father's voice echoing across that dinner table, the words, "Consider yourself a stranger," replaying like a scar pressed too hard. But instead of breaking me, the memory became fuel. It reminded me why I refused to go back, why I stopped answering calls, why silence was my final boundary. My parents aged quickly, worn down not by me but by the emptiness they had chosen. Relatives told me their house was quiet now, the grand dinners gone, the laughter replaced by silence too heavy to ignore. My sister's downfall was even sharper. Her debts swallowed her pride, her circle abandoned her, and the girl who once smirked at my exile was now the ghost of her own ambition. I never gloated, never reached out to twist the knife. I didn't need to. Their collapse was their own doing. They had written me out thinking they were freeing themselves of dead weight, but in reality they cut away the only person who had quietly been holding them together. And I? I became the version of myself they had always been too blind to see. Stronger, freer, untouchable. My revenge wasn't the court documents or the assets, though those mattered. My revenge was walking through life every single day without them, knowing they could never take that away. They had wanted me to be a stranger, and I became one, only not in the way they imagined. I became a stranger to the weak, silenced version of myself they had created, and in doing so, I became someone entirely new, someone they could never control again. The final time I heard from them came in the form of a letter, handwritten in my mother's slanted script. The envelope was thin, the paper trembling in my hands as I unfolded it. The words were simple, almost pitiful. "We miss you. We regret how things turned out. Please come back before it's too late." For a moment, I sat in silence, letting the ink blur slightly as my eyes traced each line. Years ago, those words might have broken me, might have sent me rushing back to prove myself, to earn what I thought was love. But now all I felt was clarity. They weren't reaching out because they finally saw me. They were reaching out because time had taken away the power they once wielded. Their empire was gone. Their golden daughter was scattered in debts and failed promises. And the house that had once been their kingdom was little more than walls filled with regret. They weren't asking me back as a daughter. They were asking me back as the person who had always carried them, the safety net they destroyed. And I wasn't going to give that to them again. I folded the letter neatly, placed it in a drawer with the birthday card from years before, and closed it softly. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet finality that told me I had nothing left to prove. My story with them had ended the night they cast me as a stranger, and every step I had taken since had been my own. That was enough. More than enough. Today, my life is not defined by absence but by presence. The presence of people who love me without conditions, of choices I make without fear, of peace I earned through fire. I no longer wonder what my life might have been if they had chosen differently, because the truth is, their rejection gave me everything their acceptance never could: freedom, independence, and the strength to stand without apology. Sometimes, when I pass a family gathered at a restaurant or hear laughter spilling from a crowded dining room, I feel a pang. But then I remember the night I was told I was a stranger, and I smile. Because that stranger walked out of the ashes and built a life so full, so real, it no longer has room for their shadows. I am not the daughter who begged at their table. I am not the sister who cowered under someone else's spotlight. I am not the stranger they cast out. I am something far more powerful, my own. And in the end, that is the kind of revenge no one can ever take away.